In today's video, I'm going to be deep diving on how to draw an accurate portrait in profile in 4 basic steps. Our muse is Mads Mikkelsen, just because his face is pretty awesome. I'm going to be using a black wing pencil to do my drawing in my Moleskine notebook. I also have my photo reference on my iPad. You don't need an iPad, you don't even need a Procreate app for drawing. You can use a photograph and draw on it, or even just a picture and just do the comparison in your head. I will be using it to draw on the photograph, but that's just to demonstrate my thought process. The first stage, we're really just trying to capture the outside shape of the head. When I'm doing a profile picture, I really find that starting off with a cube is something that just seems to flow and work quite well for me. So you can just see me demonstrating it here when I get the right paint colour. So what we're looking for is a cube shape. Not everyone is going to fit neatly inside the cube. Obviously, people have different faces, and if someone's got a lot of hair, for example, they might not neatly fit inside a cube. So it's fine to let someone sort of spill out in one direction or another. So here you can see I've just aligned the cube around Mads' head. I've gone from his nose touching on the right hand side to the back of his head on the left, and then top to bottom it's from the top of his hair down to his chin. I chose this one because his hair is cut very close to his head, so it doesn't interrupt the picture too much. You really get to see the bones of his face quite clearly. I'll show a couple of other examples with a woman and also some with more hair in a little bit, so we can see how you might map them into this cube. I like starting with a cube because it really helps us decide where to position the face on a page, and a cube is something you can always measure with a ruler and just check it if you're not sure. So composition, or the way someone's positioned on the page, is quite important. In this example, you can see Mads' shoulder goes off to the back, so I've just positioned the cube slightly towards the right hand side of my page. I am trying to keep the picture roughly to the same scale. That just makes it a little bit easier for our brains to compare and contrast. Once I've got the cube, I've just divided it into halves both ways. And when we do that, you can see the face sits quite nicely within these cubes, with the face on the cubes on the right hand side and the back of Mads' head on the left. And actually we can see there's some very important facial features that fall along these lines. For example, the centre line actually touches the edge of Mads' ear. It also goes across his eye and the bridge of his nose. The centre line as well also goes past the back of the jaw, which I think is quite helpful. Obviously, if someone is facing forward or backward, then they might not fall along this line. If someone is looking up in the air, what we see is the eye moves up and the ear moves down. And equally, if they're looking down, then the eyes will move down and the ear moves up. So it's very important to look at that. You can always pivot the cube to kind of follow so that the front of the cube is always the front of the face. But equally, actually, it's fine to keep the cube orientated with the viewer and the page. You just need to really be aware of where the midline falls along that line on a horizontal axis. So yeah, just something to really pay attention to. This is a little bit like gridding, I would say, in terms of we're kind of comparing where features are. I'm not a massive fan of gridding. I think it really stops people from learning how to draw, so I struggle to say positive things about it. I think where this is very slightly different is this is not something that we always have to do on a page. This is something that we can do mentally. And what we're doing is we're just kind of helping us define the envelope shape of the head. Now, as I've talked about already, a portrait in profile is very challenging. I think we have certain assumptions of what happens on a portrait that is in profile angle, and I think those assumptions can really mess up drawings, and I'll talk about that in a little bit of detail later. If you've watched my other video on how to draw a human head in five steps, then I would recommend catching that as well. I go into a little bit more detail about what I'm talking about here, and that's all about getting the envelope shape of the head. The envelope shape of the head is, if we had to draw the head in, say, 6, 7, 8 lines, how would we describe that? And where would we draw those lines? There's no kind of set formula for how you draw the lines. I think it's definitely, you look at the picture and you just draw them in a way that makes sense to you. So for example, you can see I've just gone straight down on the front of his face from the bridge of his nose right to the end of his chin, just because I felt there's lots of kind of wiggly lines around the front of his face that I just wanted to kind of ignore for now. I'm really trying not to dive into features at this stage of the drawing. I'm trying to get the rough side of his head correct without any distractions. So I think sometimes cutting out bits of the drawing that are a bit distracting and wobbly at this stage can be quite helpful. So you can see as I draw in the lines, I'm focusing on a few different things. Firstly, I'm focusing on the angle of those lines. So where I've drawn a line on the left, I can see against this 4x4 grid where it starts and terminates. What I can also compare is the angle of that line. And now when I'm thinking of an angle of a line, I like to think of it as an hour hand on a clock. I've talked about this a bit, but I just find that kind of, for me, it triggers it quite well. So that line going from the back of Mad's head to down the back of his neck, we might say that's kind of roughly 5:30 maybe, or 11:30, either way. So I think getting that's kind of a way of, I guess, thinking about it. If you're drawing from life, you can still do the same exercise. I think if we're drawing from life, you just need to make sure you get that vertical plumb line, which is that straight up and down line, because that's what you want to compare other distances and angles against. The thing that I always get wrong is the ear, so I've just tried to map it in here and I can see I've put it in the wrong place already. So this is definitely not, just because you've got a grid of 4 doesn't mean you won't make mistakes. So what I would say when drawing any face, is try not to get attached to these early lines. Even if you think these lines are accurate, they have a tendency to move over time. So really try not to get too attached to them, because as a drawing evolves, it moves, it flexes, it stretches, lines creep around. So you really want to make sure that you're not getting attached to these lines. And I think that's why having straight lines really does help, because it's very difficult to get incredibly attached to a boring straight line like I've done down the back of his neck. So yeah, keep it as simple as possible. Now I talked a little bit earlier about how his face is kind of all wiggly. So again, going back to this premise of breaking things down into straight lines, if we break these distances down further and we look for more straight lines, then we can slowly build our way towards a more accurate drawing or representation of lines that kind of curve in and out. So you can see I've broken it down in halves. There's no rule that says it has to be halves. Sometimes for faces, I think it's quite helpful to break it into thirds, top to bottom. So I think it's one of those ones of try not to stick too closely to these rules. I think halves works quite well on this face because Mads is so straightforward. So it's worked quite well. But there's no rule that says you have to do that. So you can see here I'm comparing distances. You can do this again in life. You just need to hold out your pencil, measure a distance, and then compare it to another distance. So you can move your pencil up and down. You can also turn it 390 degrees to check distances as well. So you can see here that I'm just trying to double check that my lines are, this cube that I've drawn is, all the lines are accurate and the distances are properly halves. So what you'll see later on is, although I've done something that involves a lot of measuring and I think it's fairly accurate, I've still put things in the wrong place. So I think that's something you just need to bear in mind. So stage 2 is moving from this very basic facial outline, which I've done in just a few lines with no features, and to start mapping in some of those facial features and start bringing in some smaller shapes and smaller lines. The first thing I'm going to tackle is noses. Now, if we think about a nose, I think the mistake that everyone often makes is they kind of just stick the nose onto the face. So you can see that I've illustrated there in that quick sketch. What we see in reality is actually the nose doesn't just stick out from the face, it also goes into the face as well. So often the top lip from the side is actually somewhere halfway along the bottom of the nose, it's not on the end of it. So that's definitely something to look out for when you're drawing a face in profile. You just, the important factor is, and that's because the nose in the skull is kind of recessed in. The important factor is not to let your brain get in the way and try and tell you that something should be something, not to get complacent. You're really teaching yourself when you draw a face is to just be completely observant. It's so easy for your brain to get involved and try and mess things up. So you can see here I've drawn a straight line, and that's mapping from the end of Mad's eyeball. It goes down past the end of his nose, down to the bottom of the edge of his lip. So we can see that although, Mad's nose is quite distinctive, it actually goes quite a bit into his face as well. So it's important that we capture that, and you're always wanting to compare distances up and down to make sure that you're not putting things in the wrong place. I mean, the shapes and the distances in a face are so subtle that it will become quite obvious if you get them wrong. So here I'm just trying to really figure out that line that runs along the eye and the nostril and the lip against the other line I did, which is kind of the end of his face. So I'm really, as the distances get smaller, it becomes more obvious where things are wrong. So again, this is another argument for making sure you don't get too attached to the lines you're drawing. I've drawn them quite hard in this just so that it's visible to the camera as much as possible, but if you're doing this at home, I would suggest keeping those lines as light as possible. So you're almost just kind of gently running your pencil along the page without pressing down too much. Now, sometimes when it comes to features, it's the same premise as the whole head. You really want to simplify those lines as much as possible and follow lines along. So for example, there I was drawing just to illustrate following the line of Mad's lips. Now Mad's face is very distinctive. His bottom lip and the top of his chin is quite sunken in, whereas his top lip and the end of his chin are quite prominent. So it's very important that we capture those elements accurately, because what is distinctive about a face is recognisable about a face. So if you make the mistake of really not observing the unique aspects of someone's face and replicating those, that's when a drawing just kind of doesn't really look like them. And sometimes actually by observing what's different and kind of maybe turning the dial up a little bit on those features, that's when we end up with something that's almost not caricatured, but something that's just like instantly recognisable as that person. So yeah, I think sometimes this is where this comes in quite useful, because when you're really kind of drawing those lines in and taking a cold hard look at people's faces, then you notice things that are slightly unique and different. So like there's a line along Mad's face there that's quite distinctive, that I'm just kind of trying to map in as well. So yeah, I definitely find those kind of angles around the cheek and the chin is quite useful to capture those with more kind of angled lines rather than straight up and down. And equally the eye socket as well. I always find that's a bit of a tricky one, like the end of the eyeball. It's very easy to kind of make that too sunk into the face. Actually, the end of the eyeball is very close to the bridge of the nose. So it's important to get that distance correct, and also the distance to the edge of the eye socket as well. If you're looking at someone from side on, actually a lot of that's quite compressed. So I think sometimes we have a tendency to kind of exaggerate that distance around the edge of the eyeball too much. So again, another argument for really just kind of picking some points and mapping them in. We can see here that edge of the eye socket actually sits quite nicely as kind of roughly halfway into the face. So if I can map that point, then I can get the angle of his eye as well. So again, this isn't something that just relies on having a photograph. You can follow the exact same process when you're drawing from life. You're just looking for those angles where, you're picking something that's the midpoint and measuring other things from that. So here I'm trying to get the nose right. Again, this won't be accurate. You'll see when I get to the refining phase that I have to do a lot of work to adjust these things. So yeah, it's very important not to, to draw quite lightly and not get too attached at this stage. It's kind of hard to know when to stop, I think, with this. It is quite important not to get into too much detail at this stage, so I find maybe doubling or tripling the number of lines that you're doing at this more detailed phase is probably about right. Here you can see I'm just mapping the hairline, and I'm just comparing it against other distances. As the distances get smaller, it'll be easier to eyeball them, and this might be the stage where you start to spot errors. And the last thing I'm doing is just mapping in the mouth. Again, this is something where it's very easy to get it wrong. I always find it's best to just draw one straight line, which is kind of the midline of the mouth where the lips meet. Again, it's important to get the angle of that line and the width of that line accurate, so just making sure that you're measuring against other things. And luckily that edge of the corner of the mouth is usually quite a distinct point that we can measure off. So I just thought I'd take a little bit of time to compare some other faces. So we've got Tamino here. I've picked him because he's got a lot of hair, so I thought that might be an interesting comparison. It's always hard to know whether to kind of crop the hair off or not, but you can still map the person into the frame. That cube quite easily. Again, his eyes are on that midline. His face is sort of turned more around, so you're sort of seeing more eye socket. But again, you're seeing that several things are very similar. So the top line of his lip is halfway across his nose. Tamino is much more straight and up and down on his lips, unlike Mads, who has that kind of diagonal line, but you can still see he's got a similar line of his lips. So I think the more you draw, the more you compare things. So it's quite interesting to kind of compare different faces. A lot of young men will often have the same landmarks on their face. Tamino's got a kind of a sharper, higher jawline, which you'll also see in women as well, although women's jaws are usually more narrow and rounded. So I think it does take a little bit of a while. The challenging thing you'll probably notice is that there's not actually a lot of difference in distances, even with such different faces. The differences between certain features, if I'm just kind of comparing it against this mapping that I did for Mads, there's not a huge amount of difference there. Again, exactly the same when I map it onto a woman's profile. So, we're talking millimeters here, and this is why portraiture is so challenging, I guess, is, sometimes the distances, the differences are just millimeters, which is why it's quite challenging. So yeah, women often have like the bottom half of their face is kind of shorter often. They have kind of smaller lips. That's like maybe a smaller jawline, I would say. Sometimes lips are fuller, sometimes not. And often smaller noses as well. So there's minor differences, but again, they're not huge. I think often they're quite subtle. Often women have like a narrower forehead as well, but you don't see that so much when you're looking kind of from the profile angle. I did spot that my ear was slightly off, so I adjusted it. Unfortunately, I didn't adjust it enough. The final ear is still in the wrong place. Just doing some final adjustments here. So the next stage of the drawing is just the refinement. We're going to be taking that rough drawing that's very angular, and we're going to turn it into something that's a little bit more accurate. The first thing I'm doing is just raising and knocking back some of those lines with an eraser. You don't have to do this if your underdrawing is quite light. I think because I did my underdrawing quite heavily, I just wanted to kind of knock it back a little bit. If you are erasing, then just make sure that the important lines that you want to continue using, that you're not rubbing those out too much. So I'm going to speed this up a little bit because this stage goes a little bit slower. I would say that what we're doing is we're really spending our time looking left and right at this stage and still focusing on straight lines. It's just that those straight lines are smaller and closer together, so they will give an impression of curved, smoother lines at more of a distance. And you can see the way I'm drawing, I'm just being a bit more thoughtful and a bit slower when I am drawing those lines. So I'm really kind of thinking and observing at this stage. So here you can see me working my way around the face. As you can see, I'm still trying to use straight lines in my drawing as much as possible. I'm also looking left and right a lot. I am kind of methodically working my way around the edge of the face, but I am trying to kind of keep my eyes skirting around the whole of the drawing on the left, the whole of the reference picture on the left hand side. Again, try and keep these lines light. They still may be incorrect. I often find that some of the mistakes I don't even notice until I'm at the final stage, which is applying the tone phase. So although a drawing might look quite accurate at this stage, actually there is a chance that even these lines aren't quite right. So you just got to be careful not to get into too much detail, not to spend too much time, and not to get too attached. So I think a profile in particular is a good one to use the overlay with to just check your accuracy. It can be very frustrating to spend a long time doing a drawing and for it not to be accurate at the end of the day. So don't be embarrassed about using tools like overlay. I'll put a link in the top in case you want to use or have an equivalent tool that you can use for your drawings. It does require some kind of photo reference to compare against or to overlay over your drawing, but it is very helpful. So again, I'm not trying to get anything too detailed at this stage. These lines, some of them I'm fixing, some I'm erasing, they're probably still wrong. What I'm trying to do is just kind of figure out the main areas that I want to fill in and maybe just hone in on the profile contour outline a little bit more for when I move into the next stage. So the next stage of the drawing is to start applying some tone. So you can see I'm starting off with straight up and down lines. You don't have to do this. You can use whatever kind of shading works for you. There's no strict rules here. I just quite like this as a starting point. But you'll see in this drawing a little bit further on, I do kind of build up some smudging and more flat tones. You're really focusing on posterizing the picture. So really squint and just try and separate things into broadly light and dark areas. You don't want to disappear into too many small areas at this stage. So for example, you don't want to work on the slightly mid-tones around his forehead. You want to really focus on kind of blocking in the big light and dark shapes to get started. So this is my blender. It's a blending paper stump. I think it's a Winsor & Newton one. Yeah, they're not very expensive. You can use a piece of toilet paper, you can use a beauty blender. I'm just using it to kind of unify some of the shadow that I'm seeing. Once you smudge, you might go over those lines a little bit, so you are going to have to continue go in and fix the drawing and adjust the drawing. I found this stage of the drawing a little bit frustrating because he wasn't just really giving me quite the right likeness. I think there was a few errors. If you're having this struggle, then a few strategies you can use if it's not kind of looking right is you can take a break, walk away, give your eyes a little bit of a rest. You can turn the picture upside down. That sometimes works. I've done that a little bit further along in the recording. Or you can use something like an overlay as well. That's kind of the ultimate move to check your drawing, I think. So I think a few combination of those things I think can help kind of break through and for you to figure out what's wrong. And sometimes it's not one thing, sometimes it's several small things. I think the problem is if a drawing is too wrong, then sometimes you can try and fix it in the wrong direction if you don't actually know what's wrong with a drawing before you try and fix it. But I mean, this is this frustrating stage of tweaking drawings until you think you figure out what's wrong with them. That's part of the learning process. I don't think you can be a good artist until you can feel confident that you can make mistakes and fix them. Otherwise you're always going to be trapped in that stage where you do a perfect drawing and then slowly colour it in. Part of being a brilliant artist is just being able to make errors and being able to kind of fix your way out of them, and I think that's where a lot of the beauty comes from. So I think it's very important to kind of sit with something that isn't quite right and try and figure out how to kind of work your way through that and identify the issues. So yeah, he's definitely, for me looking at now, he's not got the greatest likeness right now, and it's probably just the smallest things that are throwing it off. I did have his eye slightly in the wrong place. I didn't quite get the angle of his brow quite right. Perhaps his mouth at the moment is looking a little bit too wide. It might even just be the shading that's throwing it off. So a number of different things can throw it off. I think the thing to do is just keep pushing through and just try and, as accurately as possible, just capture the drawing. I am measuring, continually measuring, especially when something isn't looking quite right. I think sometimes it's good to fall back on your measuring. So here you can see me turning the drawing upside down. Again, this is one of the ways I have of kind of resetting my eyes. I sometimes find that I spot a lot of errors as soon as I do that. And you can see I'm going in and fixing quite a few things. They might not be the right fixes, but I think as long as it moves in the right direction, I might eventually figure out what it is that I need to fix. Definitely from memory, one of the things that was completely wrong was the ear, so that's pretty hilarious that I spent so much time trying to get in the right place and still didn't manage it. In terms of the way I'm shading in, I did do quite a lot of blending. I think the whole subject of hatching is a little bit of a tricky one. I think it takes a little while to figure out. Honestly, I don't think my hatching at the moment is particularly great. My drawings often look quite messy. So I definitely think it's something I need to work on. Maybe I need to do some more ink drawings, not too sure. Don't be afraid to use your eraser if there's areas that are too dark or there's areas you're struggling with. I think sometimes in oil painting we do the scrape back, which is where you just get your palette knife and you just scrape away all the painting and then you just kind of go back to the start. But you're never really going back to the start because you can still see the colours on the palette, on the canvas, you can still see the drawing, and I think the same is true of pencil. I think it's absolutely fine to just use your eraser and just kind of rub out a section and see if you can figure it out. So here I'm just doing an overlay. So I did find a few errors when I was doing this. Mostly around the eye. I made his eye a little bit too big and that was throwing it off. He just needed to kind of have a slightly higher head as well. So yeah, it's amazing how it only takes a few tiny little things to really throw things off. So now I'm going back and fixing the most glaring errors that I spotted in that overlay and just adding a little bit more tone. What you'll find is at first that the errors will be much bigger, but throughout time, as you get more and more practiced, the errors you make will seem, I mean, they'll still be as glaringly obvious to you as your eye gets more adjusted, but they'll be less obvious, I think, to other people. So I think that's one thing as an artist, we always beat ourselves up because our eyes get so refined that we really find the errors glaring. So yeah, but I mean, people are pretty good at recognizing faces, so maybe these errors are still obvious. Maybe people will still say, it kind of looks like Mads, but not quite, without really understanding what is why. So yeah, another fun challenge with portraiture. So it's getting to the stage it's fairly finished for me. I spent about an hour on this drawing, I want to say, so yeah, it took me about an hour. Could have kept going, could keep refining, maybe I will one day, but I was pretty happy that it was fairly close. Just using my eraser to pick out some more highlights, blend some more form, but overall it is pretty much done. So this is the final drawing of Mads. I hope you found the video today useful. If you did, leave a thumbs up, subscribe, all that jazz, and I'll catch you in the next video. Thanks very much, guys. Bye bye.